The road ends here. Behind them, the horizon vibrates with the rhythmic thunder of iron wheels and the rising dust of an empire's wrath. Ahead, the sea stretches wide, a wall of churning blue that offers no passage. Thousands of people huddle against the shoreline, the air thick with the sharp tang of salt and the suffocating grit of desert sand. Mothers pull their children into the center of the mass, shielding eyes from the glint of bronze armor that signals the end. There is no path left to take. The army of Pharaoh is closing the distance, a storm of iron and rage that has run them to the very edge of the world. Panic ripples through the crowd, a low, jagged sound of collective terror as the realization sets in. They are trapped. Moses stands at the front of the line, his feet planted in the wet sand. He does not look back at the encroaching death. His gaze is fixed on the horizon of the water, his knuckles white as he grips his staff. The wind begins to pick up, whipping sand against their skin, but he does not blink. To understand the weight of this moment, we must look back to a time when the name of Moses was not a cry of hope, but a secret whispered in the shadows of the Nile. Egypt was a land of stone and sorrow. For generations, the Hebrew people lived under the crushing weight of the lash. In the brickyards, the sun beat down on bent backs, and the air was heavy with the heat of the kiln and the sound of weeping. Pharaoh, fearing the growth of this enslaved nation, issued a decree that chilled the blood of every Hebrew mother. Every son born to them must be cast into the river. Jochebed sat in the dark of her home, her fingers moving with frantic precision. She wove a basket of papyrus, sealing the gaps with pitch and bitumen. She placed her newborn son inside, her hands trembling as she smoothed the reeds. She carried him to the riverbank, the water lapping against the mud. With a final, sharp intake of breath, she set the basket among the tall stalks. Miriam stood hidden in the grass, her eyes wide, watching the small vessel drift. The river was a place of death, yet the basket held steady, floating toward an uncertain fate. In that silence, a fragile hope emerged from the reeds. Moses grew up within the marble halls of the palace, his life defined by the luxury of the court. Yet, he remained a man divided. He walked with the stride of a prince, but his eyes were constantly drawn to the fields where the labor never ceased. The tension reached a breaking point under the midday sun. He watched an Egyptian taskmaster lift a lash against a Hebrew slave, and the rage of his hidden identity erupted. Moses stepped forward, his hands striking the oppressor with the force of a lifetime of suppressed anger. The man fell, and in the sudden, heavy silence that followed, Moses knew his life in the palace had ended. He did not wait for the guards. He turned and fled, leaving behind the gold and the stone of the city for the brutal, silent expanse of the Midian desert. The transition was absolute. He stripped away his former life, trading the weight of his status for the solitary burden of a shepherd's staff. He was no longer a prince of the court, but a man of the earth, waiting in the silence for a path he could not yet see. The slopes of Mount Horeb were dry, the rock beneath his feet fractured by the relentless sun. Moses led his flock through the narrow passes, his staff clicking rhythmically against the stone. Then, the wind died. The air grew heavy, charged with an unnatural heat. Ahead, a bush stood against the gray cliff, engulfed in a roaring flame that refused to consume the leaves. The fire did not flicker. It pulsed. Moses stopped. He stepped forward, his sandals grinding into the grit, and moved closer until the heat forced him to shield his face. A voice broke the silence, calling his name from the heart of the light. He fell to his knees, his hands gripping the dry earth. The command was clear. Return to Egypt, confront the throne. Moses looked at his hands, calloused and stained by the desert. The shepherd stood, his fingers tightening around his staff. He turned his back on the quiet life of the hills and looked toward the horizon. The throne room was cold, the air stagnant with the scent of incense and old stone. Moses stood before the golden seat, his staff resting against the floor. Beside him, Aaron spoke the demand. "Let my people go." Pharaoh leaned forward, his gaze hardening as he dismissed the request with a sharp wave of his hand. The refusal hung in the air for only a second before the change began. Outside, the Nile slowed, its waters thickening until the river turned to deep, dark blood. The stench of rot rose from the banks, choking the city. Pharaoh did not flinch, even as the sky darkened with the hum of gnats and flies. The insects descended in clouds, covering the palace walls and the fields alike. Every chamber filled with the sound of wings and the frantic movement of swarms. The land groaned under the weight of the judgment. Crops withered in the heat, and the livestock fell in the pens. Yet, each time the plague struck, Pharaoh retreated further into his pride. He watched the devastation from his balcony, his jaw set, his resolve tightening like a fist. He refused to yield, even as the very foundations of his kingdom began to crumble under the relentless pressure of the divine hand. The final night arrived in absolute, suffocating silence. Inside every Hebrew home, families knelt by their thresholds. They dipped hyssop into the basin and brushed the blood across the wooden doorposts. No one spoke, no one moved. The air outside felt heavy, as if the night itself were holding its breath. Then, the shadow passed over the land. Inside the palace, the stillness shattered. A single, piercing cry erupted from the royal chambers, followed by a chorus of wailing. In the Hebrew quarters, the sound was the signal. Doors flew open. Thousands of people spilled into the dark. The chains of generations snapped in the sudden rush of movement. They did not look back at the brickyards or the kilns. The gates of the city groaned as the mass of humanity pushed through, leaving the land of their sorrow behind. The sun began to bleed light over the horizon, illuminating a sea of faces turned toward the unknown. For the first time, they walked with heads held high. The journey ended at the water's edge. The sea stretched out, a vast, unmoving barrier of deep blue that offered no path forward. The people stopped, their momentum dying as they stared at the impossible expanse. Then, the wind shifted. It carried a low, rhythmic thrumming that vibrated through the soles of their feet. From the desert horizon, a dark cloud of dust began to rise. It was the sound of iron wheels biting into the sand. The rumble grew into a roar, shaking the ground beneath them. The glint of bronze appeared through the haze, hundreds of chariots surging forward. The panic was instantaneous. Mothers clutched their children, while men scrambled toward the water. The air grew thick with the metallic tang of fear. They turned on Moses, pointing toward the approaching dust. "Were there no graves in Egypt?" they shouted. Moses stood at the very front, his knuckles white as he gripped his staff, his gaze locked on the iron wheels. Moses did not argue. He did not look back at the screaming crowd or the thundering wheels. He stepped forward, right to the edge of the froth, and raised his staff high above his head. The air instantly vanished. A sudden, violent gust ripped across the surface of the sea, howling with a force that flattened the reeds and forced the people to their knees. It was a sound like 1,000 storms colliding at once. Then, the water began to recoil. It did not merely recede. It tore itself apart. With a deafening, grinding roar, the sea surged upward, stacking into towering, translucent walls that stretched toward the clouds. The pressure was immense, a weight of liquid glass held back by an invisible hand. Between these shifting, churning mountains, the seabed emerged. Moses lowered his staff, his breath hitching as he looked at the dry ground. The path was open. He took the first step. The chariot surged into the gap, iron wheels clattering against the exposed stone of the seabed. The horses strained, hooves kicking up salt and debris. Then, the wind died. The towering walls of water, held back by an invisible grip, suddenly lost their tether. With a sound like the earth itself cracking, the sea collapsed. The water did not flow. It fell. It crashed down with the weight of a mountain, swallowing the chariots, the horses, and the pride of Egypt in one thunderous, suffocating breath. The path vanished. The sea returned to its place, flat and indifferent, leaving only the sound of the tide pulling back from the shore. On the far bank, the silence lasted for a single, heavy heartbeat. Then, a sharp, rhythmic jingle cut through the air. Miriam stepped forward, a tambourine flashing in her hand. She struck it, the metallic ring echoing across the vast, empty desert. She began to dance, her feet moving in time with the pulse of the music, her voice rising in a song of triumph that filled the space where terror had lived. The people joined her, their voices swelling into a chorus that shook the night. The journey was far from over, but the impossible had been done. The sea had stood still, and the chains were broken. This moment stands as a reminder. When the way forward is blocked, faith creates a path. If this story of deliverance touched your heart, please like this video and subscribe to Divine Whisper for more journeys through the ancient records.